Hello, class, and welcome to week 13 of the Philosophy of God here at Holy Apostles College and Seminary. This is, of course, Jonathan Studi, your professor, and let's just dive right in here. We are in the midst of talking about God's operations, and last week we talked about God's intellect. This week, however, we're going to be moving on to a discussion of God's divine will. And now, as was the case with last week, we're going to start with a general discussion of the nature of the will, but what we need to do first is continue to back it up a little bit. And the reason for this is that Aquinas says that a will is an appetite. So, in order to understand what an appetite is, or understand what a will is, it's fitting for us to understand what an appetite is. So, let's begin there in that very general notion of an appetite, and then move on to the more specific notion of wills in general, and then God's will in particular. So, Aquinas says that a will is an appetite. Now, appetites in general are inclination towards some good. So, let's say a rock, or an head, let's say a rock has an appetite to fall to the ground. Now, this isn't quite right because it's not a living thing. However, there still is an inclination or a drive or an impulse for a rock to return to the ground once it's been tossed up in the air because of gravity and the whole whole thing doing with mass and physics, etc., etc., etc. That's just how physical things work. They're attracted to the nearest source of local gravity, or the strongest local source of gravity. Um, Now, the term appetite comes into play most appropriately once a thing begins to, well, or once we find a living thing, and especially in animals. However, we do find it to some extent in plants as well, because plants have a tendency to grow their roots down into the ground because they are trying to fulfill the good of, well, being anchored to the ground and of drawing up nutrients and water from the soil. But they also have a tendency to spread the leaves out towards the sun. If you leave a flower out all day, what you'll notice is that, especially one where it gets a lot of light, it will actually follow the sun throughout the day. We've all seen this. I'm sure most of us know this already, but it's a very interesting phenomenon. In fact, I should probably do that with my son. That'd be an interesting little science experiment for us as I'm homeschooling. But we have it more appropriately within animals because animals have more of a cognitional awareness of the good that they desire. Um, Both me and a dog might have a desire for a steak that's cooking, or might think about a steak. We want to eat the meat that we have sitting in our fridge. Well, actually, it's my fridge because I bought myself a steak, and the reason why I purchased the steak was because I actually passed my thesis defense with highest honors last week. Hooray! And so I decided to buy myself a steak in celebration because I can't go with my friends, and I can't go to the Holy Apostles graduation ceremony and hang out with my friend Chris and Dr. Delfino in celebration later. So I figured I'd buy myself a steak. Now, I desire the steak. I want it so much, but the problem is my wife wants to put things in quarantine for a few days before we can actually take it in. So whenever we have some food delivered or anything else for that matter, we have to leave it out in the kitchen, or not in the kitchen. We have to leave it out in the garage in the extra fridge, freezer, whatever, until the all surface contagions have perished, or at least are not at the level where you could actually become infected with them, which, I guess is a very, very safe way to go. But either way, I have been thinking about nothing but steak for the last 3 days. So if steak comes up a lot, I'll do my best not to. Forgive me. But I can just imagine right now digging into that perfectly marbled ribeye steak. It's like an inch and a half, 3/4 inch, or inch and 3/4 thick. It's a decent steak. Um, Cooking it up according to Chef Gordon Ramsay's recommendations that I found on YouTube. And I can smell it. I can think about it. I know it's going to be amazing, and I'm gonna have this. I have a strong desire every morning that I wake up just to go outside and start cooking it, so I can finally taste the sweet victory of having a steak after my successful thesis defense, which again went very well. I was very happy with it. Passed with highest honors. I don't know if I mentioned that first time. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But this is the most proper and typical sense of the term appetite, where we have this good that we are aware of that we do not yet possess, or that we're or one in which we are in pursuit, or of which we are in pursuit. And this is what I have for the steak right now. However, we can at some point obtain that good. And so there's this desire, this impulse to get the good. But once we get the good, we also have the desire or appetite to keep the good. And now the good that I'm going to experience when I finally get to cook and consume this delicious steak is the good of celebrating my thesis defense, for one, but also the deliciousness of the steak in general. I want to keep that forever. It's a little tiny slice of heaven, in a very very extended, analogical, and inappropriate way of talking about heaven. But in your case, we can also have an appetite to reside or rest in the good that we have to retain it. And all these sensible appetites are always fulfilled by something very specific. And so when we have a desire for hunger, that is fulfilled by eating. It has one particular thing that we can do. And the same thing with thirst. We only relieve our thirst by thirsting. We only relieve our itch by itching. So whenever we have a desire, an inclination to obtain some good on the level of sensible desires, there's only really one thing that we can do to fulfill it. Now, moving on to the will. Now, St. Thomas defines the will as an intellectual appetite, and it's inclined to the good. All right, just as the intellect is inclined towards the truth, because the intellect is inclined towards being, and the being is the good of the intellect insofar as it is knowable, and the good is being insofar as it is desirable. And so, in this sense, the will has an appetite too, but it's an intellectual appetite. So the sense appetites are inclinations towards some goods that we come to know through our senses, but the intellectual appetites, the will, are goods we come to know through the powers of our intellect. For example, education is good, and we know that we ought to pursue education for our own perfection, right? This is a very good thing. We're able to get a better job. We learn more about the world. We understand our relationship with God better. We understand our relationship with each other better through a proper education. We get to know our ethical worldview in a more profound way. All sorts of good things come from a formal education. And the will is an understanding that the will. So when we understand this, we understand that there's a good of the education, and the thing is about this education, we can get many kinds of educations. You guys can get a degree in philosophy and think the deepest thoughts. Oh, never mind. There's an old Bruce Lee quote where Bruce Lee majored in philosophy, and somebody asked him what he wants to do with that, and he said, I think the best path is to think deep thoughts about being unemployed, which is not true. Forbes magazine said that in 10 years, philosophers are going to be among the most sought after professionals in business. So just FYI, guys, if you get a degree in philosophy, your prospects are looking pretty good over the next few years here. But we can pursue an education in philosophy. We can pursue an education in physical medicine. We can pursue an education in welding or other trades, and all of these different paths are goods for us. And the will helps the will, when it understands a good, it has these many different options to choose from. Now, interestingly, like I mentioned before, the sense appetites are not free. So, and the reason for this is that they're determined to one end. Hunger is for food, right? Or thirst is for drink. But the intellectual appetite, the will, is free because intellect is not determined to one specific end. The only thing the will is determined by is that we can only will the good. We can never will evil for its own sake, for example. Rather, we can only will something as an evil only in as much as we think we are pursuing some other good. For example, people always point to Hitler. But Hitler was just pure evil. No, he wasn't. He thought that exterminating the Jews was a service to the world. He thought that what he was doing was going to be good for Germany, and by creating a master race, he was going to advance the cause of mankind as a whole. And so, sure, some people had to suffer and die, but really, those people weren't even human. They were subhuman, less than human. But what he really wanted was something good, which was the advancement of human civilization. or to make it more simple, more mundane, I have a desire for my steak, but I also have a desire to keep my wife happy. And now I could have gone out the day that the steak arrived at our house by that, that angel from what service? I don't even know which service we used to have it delivered. We got other groceries too. I could have gone out that day, cooked that steak, ate it, and loved it, and then came back in, or tried to come back in, and I would have really angered my wife. She would have been very upset with me. Now, did I want my wife to be upset with me? No, of course not. No man's that insane. Nobody's that insane. But if I would have done that, why did I do it? Why is my wife upset at me? Because I chose the good of the steak and eating the steak as a good that is above and beyond the wholeness and the harmony that should be present in my relationship with my wife and in my household as a general. In general. But I'd be mistaken. It would have been a terrible mistake for me to go out and get my prize the day it was delivered. Even though if I would have done it, I would have only done it because I saw it as some sort of good rather than some sort of evil. So we do this all the time. We often pursue the wrong ends, or what are called immediate goods, to the exclusion of ultimate goods, and we do this very often. And this is what we call a sin. And so sin, even the Greek word for sin, hamartia, means to miss the mark. It's an archery term. So you're shooting at a target, you miss the mark. Oops, you hamartia'd it, or whatever. If you want to just English-size the Greek there. But the point of the metaphor within the term is to say that when we sin, we fall short of what we ought to have been aiming at. And what we're aiming at as humans is we're aiming at, in the nearest sense, we're aiming at what it means to be fully human. We're aiming at the virtuous life. In the furthest sense, we're aiming at an imitation of God's divine, perfect, and infinitely perfect essence. And so when we sin, we're not just breaking a rule, we're actually breaking ourselves and failing to live up to everything that we could be. We're falling short of the glory that God has designed us to achieve and to obtain. And so when we sin and when we choose proximate or immediate goods to the exclusion of ultimate goods, because we should choose immediate goods sometimes, at least. If you're at a birthday party, and you've been dieting for 6 weeks and you've been doing great with it, you still want to lose a little bit of weight or something, and there's cake, go ahead and have that cake. You're celebrating the day of your friend's birth, how they came into the world. I mean, for Pete's sake, that in itself is a good thing too. So if eating cake is part of the celebration, go ahead and do it. Now, of course, if there's another factor where you have if you're diabetic and if you were to have something that's high in sugar like that, you'd have some issues with your insulin spiking and whatnot. Then, of course, it would be a bad choice for you, both in terms of celebrating your friend's life, to put your own life at risk, but then also, obviously putting your own life at risk by eating something that is not good for you. No, and I recognize that for diabetes, there's more nuance to it than that. I'm just trying to be very general here. However, the point is that we are free to choose from all sorts of different ends and all different means to the end, but we all have one end, which is going to be the good. And this is something that we can't escape from. No matter what we choose, no matter what we desire, no matter what we want to do, it's always because we think that somehow it's going to be good for us. Oh yeah, here's a slide, by the way. I apologize. Let's move on. There we go. So, I want to add an important qualification here. So God is simple, which means that he's not composed of any parts whatsoever. As a consequence, his will is identical with his intellect, because all of his attributes and operations are identical, and even and they're identical with God himself. As we've talked about before, God is his will, and whatever God has, he is. This is how we understand all of God's attributes and his operations. And so whenever we talk about God, we have to understand things analogously, and that we're only analogously similar to God, and that our way of speaking about him should not be understood as a one-to-one correlation. Because again, there's some similarity, but there's a lot of difference. We can have the same general meaning of God having a will or God existing, but the way that it goes about subsisting in God, whatever we're predicating of him, and the way that it goes about subsisting in us is going to be very far removed from the way that we understand things, because everything that we understand immediately or we understand initially about having a will or existing or having intellect, having love, is going to be confined by our imperfections and our limitations. But in God, there are no imperfections and there are no limitations. And so understanding the same general meaning in something which does not have that perfection in a limited sense makes it so that we have to take things very slowly and very carefully. We always have to remember that whenever we predicate something of God, or whenever we attribute some perfection to God, we have to understand it in a way that excludes all of the creaturely limitations that are inherent in us. And so, for St. Thomas, when we talk about the will and whether or not God has a will, the way he goes about this is he says that anything that has an intellect has a will. Necessarily. It follows as night falls upon day. Now, this can be difficult to understand. So this is how St. Thomas would argue for that. All things have a natural end or a final cause, which is defined by their forms. So, for instance, fire tends towards the final cause of heating. Electrons tend towards the final cause of doing electron things in electricity and magnetism or whatever, not being monkeys. In humans, well, we tend towards our own good of being virtuous. At least we really try. Well, hopefully we try. The form and final cause are very closely related. The form of a house, for instance, is a structure for the sake of providing a shelter. The form of the final cause, or the form of the final cause, is the very act of providing shelter. And so when we have a house that's actually been built, that is the final cause of the building of the house, which has with the form of which is fully taken root in the matter of the house. Or take humans, for instance. Humans are rational beings. So our happiness will therefore be in rational activity, at least the highest aspect of our happiness. Where, yes, of course, there's going to be some animal activity in our final cause, because we are rational animals, not just pure intellects like angels. And whenever an intellectual creature, though, has or anything really achieves its final cause, he's actualizing his form in a more fulsome sense. And this is where we talk about our virtual quantity in previous class lectures. So our final cause is rational behavior, and this is going to make us happy, whether it be the moral or intellectual virtues. Actually, it's going to be both, and ultimately it's going to be intellectual virtues, because the intellect is a higher faculty of the soul than the will. And the more we actualize or manifest this behavior, that is intellectual activities, through either moral or intellectual virtue, the more fully we realize our own nature. And because that is what it means to achieve an end. Now, for things without sense, the actualization comes through inclinations. So a rock falls down towards the ground. Great. Fantastic. So part of the form of the rock is to be attracted to the gravity, the strongest local gravity. Sensible things, however, actualize their forms through sense appetites, and intellectual beings, finally, actualize their form through an intellectual appetite. In sensitive beings, these inclinations are called sense appetites. In intellectual beings, these inclinations are called an intellectual appetite, or the will. And again, God's will and our will are only analogically similar. But this is how Aquinas makes his argument for the existence, or for God having a will. Any agent with an intellect has a will. God is an agent with an intellect. Therefore, God has a will. So there we go. Let me get to the right spot here. Boom. There we go. I think that should be right. Make sure I'm on the right side here. All right. So this is also important, obviously. So what does God will? So, uh, unlike us, remember, God is pure act, so he can't be determined by anything else outside of himself. Because if he were determined in any way whatsoever by something else outside of himself, then he wouldn't be uncaused. So he could not be the cause of all causes, because there'd be something that's causing him. My nature, in contrast to God, my end is to live virtuously. Whether or not I've done that well or not is going to be something for God to judge. And generally speaking, I know whether or not I've been doing a good job of that. One of the worst things about studying philosophy is that you more and more realize the good that ought to be done and how weak your own will is to actually pursue it and training it in that way. But the problem is that even if I know what my proper end is to live out the intellectual and moral virtues, I can't always get there. I don't have the external resources that I need. I need to train my desires to desire the right thing. I need to transform my appetites to only desire things in the proper amount, in the proper time, and in according to the proper end. But I don't always have that, or sometimes I simply don't have the resources in terms of my own knowledge to know what the right decision is to make. And these are all habits. These are all different ways of strengthening my own will, my own person, in order to obtain my good. Either way, these are things outside of myself that I have to get and have to add to me. They're things that are going to perfect me as such, as a human. But God can't have anything added to his perfections. And so what I desire, what I will, and what I need to have to fulfill my own end is something that requires or depends upon something outside of myself. But again, God can't and doesn't depend on any external resources whatsoever. He's totally perfect. So what could the object of God's will be? So the primary object for God's will is, well, God. Because, first of all, remember that the primary object of our will is the good, but the good is being considered insofar as it is desired. But since God is uttermost being, the proper object for God's will is going to be himself, because he is uttermost being and uttermost goodness and whatnot. Now, again, unlike us, God cannot be determined by an outside end outside of himself, or by an end outside of himself. Therefore, he must be his own end, right? So he is what he wills. So this shouldn't be surprising. This isn't any different at all from understanding God as the object of his own knowledge. He can't be contingent in his knowledge by all these bits of information outside of himself. He knows contingent bits only insofar as Eris affects. So God, first and foremost, wills himself, but only wills other things outside of himself insofar as he wills them for his own goodness. Now, is God's will an appetite? Okay, all right. Again, we have to be very careful with this, because it's only analogically the case that God's will is an appetite. So in our primary discussion about appetite, we're talking mostly about drives towards some good that we do not yet possess. But there is no goodness outside of God that he does not possess, so we can't talk about it in that way. However, I did mention something else. Now, insofar as appetites are directed to a good not possessed, we can in no way refer to God's will as an intellectual appetite, right? Great. However, appetites also enjoy rest in the good possessed. And in this sense, we can say that God's will is an appetite. Now, once we obtain a good and have it, and now enjoy it. That's what that means. Once we possess a a good. We can enjoy our rest in it. And since God is pure act and doesn't change, he is always resting in his own infinite perfections. So it is in this sense, the sense of a fulfilled or perfected appetite, that God is said to have an appetite that's akin to ours. But there's a bit of an objection here. Doesn't the will move us towards a good, and isn't God supposed to be unmoved? So now, this is the way it is in creatures. However, the will also rests in a possessed good, and in this sense, God has a will. God rests and is satisfied with his own goodness for all eternity, and God's will is unmoved. And he has a will, but the way he wills is different than how we will. He is pure act, entirely perfect, and unchangeable. That seems like a problem. So how is it then that God wills creation? So, if the proper object of God is himself, how is it indeed the case that God wills creation? A problem. So, think about this. Every agent, in as far as it is an act, produces the likeness of its effect. Causes can only produce in their effects something they already possessed. You might take a magnifying glass on a leaf, for instance. You can make the magnifying glass, set it on fire, but the glass doesn't have fire in it, at least not formally. Or you can think of a printing press that can make money, but it doesn't have money, at least again, not formally. But Aquinas says that the cause has the perfections of its effect. And as we talked about before, sometimes the perfections of the effect reside in the cause in a way that's formal, so it's a one-to-one correlation, so fire produces fire. Virtually, so it has the power to produce something, or eminently, so that it has the power to produce something in the highest fashion. So with the magnifying glass, it has the virtual it has fire virtually within it in concert with the sun to make the fire in the leaf. The printing press doesn't have a $20 bill, but it has a $20 bill, either virtually or eminently, depending on how you look at it, insofar as it can produce as many $20 bills as the government sees fit to print. Again, a thing has formal, has a perfection formally in the cause, as found in the effect when you have a same species causal relationship. So a man begets man, or fire begets fire. Okay. Now, whatever a thing has, as an effect, again, is somehow contained in the cause. But the cause can only do this insofar as they're an act, because an agent only does something if it is an act or can exist in the first place. If an agent is in potency only, then it will not act at all. So, for instance, unless I'm actually engaging in the act of producing a book, then I'm not doing it. Totally makes sense. I am in potency of writing a book. I have the potential to write a book. But insofar as I never actually start doing it, I will never be in the act of writing a book. Okay. It almost seems tautological. However, God is most perfectly in act. And so therefore, whenever God produces something, he most truly produces his likeness. And this is because God's will is diffusive. And what this means is that God's goodness extends outside of himself to the order of created things. But we also have to remember that God's will has its primary object his own goodness first, and then created things in a secondary manner. And he cannot will the goodness of something other than himself in a primary way. And this is because God knows himself first, and creation as his effects secondarily. But then, again, God wills his own goodness primarily, therefore, and creates things for the sake of his own goodness. Why does he will creation? Well, for the sake of his own diffusive goodness. He doesn't will created things directly in themselves, but only through himself and for his own goodness. Now, this doesn't mean that God's will is entirely selfish. In fact, because God wills created things for his own sake, he shows that he is utterly gratuitous. So there's a goodness within God, and that God is completely satisfied with that goodness. He gets nothing out of creating others. There's no ounce, if you want to call it that, of perfection that is added to God's happiness, God's contentment with himself by creating other things. And so the fact that we are privileged to exist in the very first place, let alone be offered his supernatural grace as whenever we accept faith, or whenever we enter the faith, God is utterly gratuitous in showing the fact, in showing us, allowing us to participate in existence, even though we've done nothing to earn it, even though it's not owed to us, but rather it's something that's given to us out of God's pure and utter gratuity and grace. So God is anything but selfish in desiring his own end and creating us because of that. We'll also note that God's will is causative. And this is pretty quick. Remember that God's knowledge is identical to his will. So whatever he knows or wills is what he brings about into existence. Now, we want things to happen, but we don't always get what we want. We're lazy, or we lack resources, or we don't know how to do it. Now, we have problems that get in our way and prevent us from doing what we want. But God doesn't struggle with any of these things. God's knowledge, remember, is identical to his will. So whatever he knows, he can bring things he brings into existence because he knows exactly how to obtain that reality. In the same way, there's nothing to prevent God from bringing about what he wills. And so whatever God wills to be, he causes to be. Now, does God have to will what he does will? Now, there is one thing that God must will, which is being, actually, and goodness, but it's in himself. But this doesn't mean that he is determined by something outside of himself. Remember, he is simple, and thus his will and his goodness are one and the same thing, which is why he must be his own good. Remember that when we talk about human beings, we must will our own good as well, because it's impossible that that we could desire anything under the aspect of evil for its own sake, because we're always looking for something good. We necessarily will our own happiness, even though we get it wrong more often than not. And even someone who commits suicide, for instance, still desires their own good, which is their own happiness, but they think that death is preferable to suffering that they're experiencing in life. And they're going about a pursuit of their own happiness in a totally wrong-headed fashion, but they are nevertheless pursuing their own happiness in some way, because they at least say that the cessation of suffering is going to be a preferable mode of existence than the suffering that they have. Now, in the same way, God actually wills his own goodness necessarily because he is the ultimate goodness, and he knows it because God, his knowledge, and his being are all identical. Even though we have to desire our happiness, there are many different paths that we can take to achieve our own ultimate goodness. Now, even if we know for sure that moral and intellectual virtue will constitute our own happiness, there are many paths to get there. We could, in a very legitimate way, in a very sanctified and holy way. We could do it as single people. We could do it as priests. We could do it as married folks. We could do it with a formal education or without a formal education. We could do it with different kinds of jobs. There are many paths to choose to achieve our own goal of happiness. And it's the same thing with God. God is absolutely free to his own actions and free to his own will. And God absolutely must will his creation for the sake of his own divine goodness, because divine and diffusive goodness, because there's no further end that for which God could desire things, and there's no other end that God properly desires things. But God's goodness is so absolute that his goodness does not depend on creation at all. Again, he doesn't get anything from us being created. He doesn't need creation, or any specific creation, or any creation at all for him to be perfectly happy. Therefore, because God is not determined to create in order to achieve his own proper end, he is absolutely free, and none of these things are necessary for him to desire what he wills, which is himself. So he is free from all necessity to any particular kind of world. So in this sense, God is entirely free with respect to creation. However, in regard to creation, there is no absolute necessity that God wills creation itself for any particular kind of creation. Because willing an end is to freely choose between various possible ends. Now, neither creation nor any particular kind of creation is necessary for God's ultimate end, which again is goodness itself, or him, or his very own being. Now, this is a necessity of supposition, which relates to the law of non-contradiction. A thing can't be and be at the same time in the same way. God cannot both will and not will his creation at the same time and in the same way. And because he's unchanging, he does will creation, and that will not change. But it's not necessarily it's not necessary in an unconditional sense. It's only necessary in a suppositional sense. Because God is happy with or without creation, because he is perfectly fulfilled in himself as unlimited, unbounded act of goodness. Now, I want to cover a few other characteristics of the divine will. First, the divine will is always fulfilled. Our wills, again, are at least sometimes thwarted. But God is perfect actuality and unlimited. Hence, there is no power that can rise to his level to stop him. He is not lacking anything at all. Whatever he wills, happens. But we can also know that God's will is perfect in act and not dependent on anything whatsoever. The divine will is also unchanging. God's will is pure act because he is pure act, and so he is unchanging. And remember, change is a reduction of potency to act. And since there is no potency in God, because he is pure act, there can be no change or any variability within his will. Now, to compare the divine will and the human free will, we can say that in how they relate to each other, and how God's will doesn't impose anything on the human will. We can say that God has decided that he wants some things done by necessity, whereas others are to be done contingency. And that contingency, at least some things, involves free will. And God wills or desires that things be brought about by free persons for various reasons. Now, in general, God is the first cause of all things and acts as the instrumental cause, and the acts of instrumental causes. However, he does not act contrary to the nature. So a metal baseball bat, if you wield it, doesn't suddenly shoot fire, or it wouldn't shoot fire suddenly if God wielded it. It would only act according to its nature. And so when God uses a baseball bat, he would use it according to his nature. His actions and works the same way in us. Whenever God moves us to act as creatures, he desires and works in us as free agents. And because he causes us to act to be free, so we will act. And this is because God has determined that some things, again, in the universe be done necessarily, and other things done contingently. And God wills that some things be brought by the free agency of created persons. And since there's nothing that can thwart God's actions and his desires, so it is the case that even though God's will is always fulfilled, in no way does it violate the free wills of free agents in the universe. Now, does God have free will? So this is a complicated and difficult conversation that's going on right now in the world of Thomistic philosophers and theistic personalists, which we talked a bit about. We'll talk about a little bit later. Now, theistic personalists, if I'm going to give you a very brief definition of this, a theistic personalist is someone who believes that God is more like us than not. And one of the reasons for this related to the will is that they say that if God is unchanging, in contrast to the Thomistic or the classical theist conception of God, if God is unchanging, then he could never act otherwise. And so therefore God couldn't have free will. But God must be changing, therefore, because otherwise he wouldn't have free will and he wouldn't be a person. And therefore he can't be pure act. But, however, Thomists would say that God doesn't have to be changing. He is pure act, but he's still a person. And so there's a distinction here, or there's a lot of different disagreement about terms and our understanding of how or what constitutes a person. So let's cover this debate just a little bit here. So let's talk about ends and means. We necessarily will our own happiness, and we can choose the means by which we achieve that goal. Which means that we can choose among various different ways of achieving or reaching that goal. But God necessarily wills his own goodness, because and he variously creates things for the sake of his own goodness. But none of these things are necessary for his own goodness. He doesn't require the world for his own goodness. He's totally perfect and happy and contented and good in himself. Therefore, he wills them freely and has a free will. So, the Thomistic point of view is left unassailed by this objection that unless God can change his mind about things, then he doesn't have free will. Again, God's will is free insofar as he does not depend upon his creation in order to be fulfilled or be perfected, and whether it be this creation that he actually has created or any other possible creation that could have been created. And so God is free from absolute necessity of his will, even if there is a level of suppositional necessity insofar as the creation that God has willed won't change. God isn't going to uncreate us and make something else. And we've also seen that God is pure act and unchanging. There is no active potency in him. So how can we say that he could create a world other than the one he did if there is no potency? Now, many philosophers wimp out on this one. And the objection would be basically saying that if God could have created some other world, then there are different things that could have been created. But since there would be a different effect, then there would have to have been a difference in the sum total of the cause. But since the cause of existence is God himself, if another world is brought into existence, then there would have to be something about that world which was, or there would have to be something about the cause of that world, which would be God, that was different than the one, than the God that we would find in this world. Now, again, a lot of philosophers whip out on this and just kind of deny that God is pure act, but this isn't quite right. Remember, there's something that we know for sure. We've proven this many times, that God is pure act, but we've also shown that he has a free will. And so we're not going to back down, and these are both very true things. But we would first have to say that we don't understand how these two attributes can exist simultaneously. Even if, in order to reply to this objection about difference in effect means a difference in cause. We don't have to say that even though we don't understand how these two attributes can subsist simultaneously in the same thing, it doesn't necessarily follow that either conclusion, either that God has a free will or that he is, or that he's pure act, is false. And this is the mistake that a lot of theistic personalists make when they think that will and God, will and creatures work in the exact same way. Because remember that God's will and our will are only analogously unlike. God and creatures both have will, insofar as they have an inclination towards an end. But the way that will relates to God is different than how it relates to us. God's will is not constrained by creaturely limitations of potency, so someone should say. The contingency, which would be potency, in God's act of creation, whether it be this world or another, is not on the side of God, but rather on the side of creation, because he is a necessary being who produces contingent effects. Not because of a defect in his nature, but the necessary defect in any created thing it accounts for why it is contingent and not necessary. Because anything other than God, anything that exists that's not God, by necessity is something that is contingent, limited, or in potency. And all other defects that beings might have may come from that. And since this world is not necessary, and this is true, God didn't have to create it simply because it is not God. So there's nothing necessary about this world. No. What this means is that there's no necessity that's put onto God by the fact that this world exists, and there's no and we don't exist necessarily either. Neither would any other world exist, and so God freely, or any world that could exist, the only necessary thing is God. And again, nothing is added to God's perfection by this world existing or another world existing. Okay, so the potency is entirely on the side of creation. Now, there's a certain mystery in God's will. Okay, so this is all great. And we can say that we get that will in creatures and will in God differ, but how do we reconcile pure act on one hand and his freedom of the will on the other hand? Doesn't this principle of different effect equaling a different difference in cause cause us troubles? Well, consider this analogy. So think about the nature of light. We do know that light exhibits behavior analogous to waves and particles. Now, this is a problem in quantum physics, where light can sometimes behave as a particle or sometimes as a wave in different situations. And so this seems like it's a problem. The way that waves exist and the ways that particles exist are mutually exclusive in the world. They just aren't the same thing. So how is it possible for light to be simultaneously a wave and while at the same time being a particle? Now, an astute physicist would say that we don't really believe that light is a wave and a particle in the same manner that we would normally speak of water as a wave, or waves being in water, and matter as a particle. So rather, there's something analogous to the wave existence in light, or that there is something in the essence and behavior of light that is somewhat wave-like, and likewise there's something analogous to particle existence in light. And there's something in the essence of light that produces the behaviors of a wave or the effects like a particle. Now, in the common sense, or the common or the usual notion of waves and particles, they would seem to be mutually exclusive of one another, but that's not quite right. We don't know exactly what these observations of particle-like behavior and water-like behavior are, but we know that light exhibits both somehow, but we just can't quite penetrate the nature of light to that extent yet. Now, while these properties could not exist in one thing under our usual understanding of the terms of either wave or light, we also know that because of the wave-like behaviors and the particle-like behaviors we find in light are that are a part of the essential makeup of light. What we can conclude from this is that whatever properties of this wave-like and particle-like stuff in the essence of light, we have to leave out any properties of waves or particles which mutually exclude each other. And so we don't know exactly what this wave and particle-like stuff is in itself, but what a physicist says is that we have to conclude that whatever it is about waves and particles that are mutually exclusive to one another are not included in our understanding of waviness and particliness in the nature of light, so that they can coexist in the nature of light. Similarly, whatever the analogs of wave existence and particle existence are, they must exclude the mutually exclusive qualities that we find in waves and lights in our regular world. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to coexist in light. And now, this is sort of like our understanding of God's nature. So we do know that God possesses a free will that is analogously similar to ours, but we don't quite know what that is in itself. And we know that God is pure act, which is something we just can't wrap our minds around at all. It's because God is not contained in any genus, and hence cannot be defined, because definition always comes from genus and species differences. We cannot know God's nature, although He Himself is infinitely intelligent Himself, because He is truth Himself. But we also know, so we know two things. We know that God is total, free, and pure, unlimited act. But we also know that God has a free will, but in a way that's only analogously similar to His creatures. We don't know, however, what God's free will is like. We also know that God is pure act, but again, we don't know what it is like to be a pure act, because everything we know is made up of act and potency. And so free will as we normally understand it would be perhaps incompatible with God as being pure act. However, God possesses free will in a way that transcends our mode of understanding. And our way of willing is incompatible with pure act. That's how we understand it. And in this way, God possesses and this way that God possesses free will, but the way that He possesses free will must be compatible with His being pure act, even if we can't pinpoint exactly what that entails. Sort of like how we know that the wave-likeness of light must somehow be compatible with the particle-likeness of light, the essence of light as well. So we know that because we observe these two things, which seem to be mutually exclusive in our own world, or in the ordinary use of the terms wave or light, we know that it exists in light, essentially and necessarily. We know these two things are absolutely true. But how they exist together, we're not quite sure, except that whatever aspects of waves and particles would mutually exclude one another, those aspects in the essence of light cannot be present in the way that light has waviness, wave-likeness, or particle-likeness, so that way they can exist as properties within light. Now, and again, God's free will, therefore, if we're thinking about this metaphorically here, or this analogy here, God's free will excludes any creaturely limitations and whatever it is in itself. And I'm not sure exactly what it is, but that is God's will. It must be somehow compatible with God's simplicity and His pure actuality. What I do know, however, is that God's will is beyond mind, that does not exclude itself from being purely actual and purely simple and immutable. God's essence is something I don't understand, and His will is something only analogously to mine. My will might require potency, but I know that His can't. Now, sure, I don't understand it, but this should be expected. If I can sit down and give you a genus species definition of God, then I'm not explaining God. I'm explaining Zeus or Thor or Wotan or some other finite god. The greatest mistake of the theistic personalists is to say that if God is going to be a person, then he must be a person in a similar fashion, which is one where God is a being that has a genus species definition, so that way God is one of the things that exists in the universe that is distinct from others, from the rest of us, and is in potency and can change and is imperfect in some way, shape, or form. Now, this is a huge problem, and I think that you've more or less left Christian theism at this point, which they're totally free to do, obviously, as philosophers. But Christians and Catholics, actually, we cannot affirm anything that comes out of this theistic personalist camp, just so you know. But when it comes to some of their objections about God's will being free, while God also being purely actual, we have a response and understanding that there are certain things about God's will that are analogously like ours, but whatever it is that would exclude freedom of the will in the creaturely sense from coexisting in God, who is pure act, those aspects cannot be in God's free will, whatever those happen to be. Now, did God will evil? So, in what way can God said to be the source of all that exists and yet not be the cause of evil? Well, remember this. Things are good only insofar as there is a harmony between their parts, which allows them to achieve their goal. So a tree and a person achieve their goal. So all the leaves and the stems and the vascular system and the roots of the tree all work towards the same end. And a good tree is one that works toward the ends of a tree being very well. Now, a virtuous man, human, similarly, is one who is going to have his mind. He's going to know the right thing. His will is going to desire the right thing, and his passions and his appetites are going to push and drive him towards the right thing. That's a virtuous man. All the parts are working towards its right end. Evil, on the other hand, is a privation, which doesn't entail a total lack of existing. Evil exists, but not in the same way as a substance. Privation in a thing occurs when there's a lack of harmony in a thing's parts or within an order of another kind. And so evil is actually a parasitic disruption of the harmony that we find in God's order. And so when you have a person's eye that has a lens that's been torn, you're no longer able to make images from the light that passes through their pupil. Or if your brain is damaged, you might not be able to you might not have the same moral sense that you did before, or you might lose your sense of smell. Interestingly enough, one of the first signs of cancer for many people is brain cancer for many people is that they've lost their sense of taste and smell, because something about the brain allows us to obtain those senses, or to experience those sensations of taste and smell. And those things are evil. Those are not good, because they prevent us from achieving our final end, or our final good in the fullest sense. So there's a disharmony. There's some chaos. There's some disruption, or parasitic leeching off of our good that whatever the evil thing is has now inflicted upon us. So good is the presence of harmony that should be there, whereas evil is a chaos or a disorder. Now, how can you prove this? Well, could there be anything that exists that is pure disorder or lack of harmony? No, it's inconceivable, because that would mean that there's no being in any way whatsoever. Remember, blindness is a privation of sight, whereas where sight should be. A rock isn't blind. So evil, in the same way, evil is a privation of being, if you speak most generally. So just as there is no blindness where there is no should-be sight, there is no evil where there is no being. Simple as a tear. Now, the world is limited and imperfect. And so there's always going to be some way in which creatures fail to kind of get along in the right way, especially in a material world. Consider an oak tree that begins to grow. The bigger oak tree grow because it was just planted. So the seed goes into the ground, it takes root, and it starts to sprout up. And this is all great and good. But unfortunately, it fell into the shade range of a bigger oak tree, which gets in the way of the sun and prevents it from reaching the little oak tree. And so the little oak tree doesn't get the nutrition from the sun that it needs, and unfortunately withers away and dies. This is just the way physical things interact. They're always going to be bumping into each other somehow and getting in each other's ways. Especially if there's going to be some sort of if God wills the good of predatory creatures, then he has to have prey, which will cease to exist in some way, because they're being consumed by the creatures. Unless you have, like, what is it, the Simpsons movie where there's that pig. You can take the bacon off of it and it just grows again. Which there's some things out there like that, kind of like plants, and you take the fruit off of it, keeps on growing more fruit. But God, in his infinite wisdom, willed that certain things exist and live in certain ways, and that doesn't necessarily mean that he has willed any evils, but rather he has willed certain kinds of goods. And so you can't really create a material world without some evils as a consequence. And now it's impossible, again, for God to will an evil, because we know this. Now, willing a material world makes evil somehow necessary, because the world is necessarily limited and contingent, and nothing in it is really perfect. Things get in one of those ways. The predator-prey relationship, again, or for example, cannot be mutually beneficial. If the prey escapes, the predator suffers as well. And vice versa. So therefore, the evil that we find in the world is only willed indirectly by God, what we call the consequent will, not the antecedent will. Obviously, God desires the goodness of all things, which is himself. But as a consequence of the world that he's created, the goods that he's created in this world, there are some things which will happen by the very nature of having material things, or by having free creatures in it. Just like how we can say that in the Bible, it says both that God wills the salvation of all men, but we also know that not all men are going to be saved. So are we saying that God's will is somehow thwarted? Well, no, of course not. God wills all men to be saved insofar as he's made them all for himself. But because of their free choices, and because the necessity of free choice for the greater good that would come about in the world had he not created creatures with free choice. The consequence of that is that some of these free creatures will use their freedom to choose to turn away from God. And instead of beholding the impenetrable light of, or infinitely penetrable light of God's glory, instead, the damned, they only get to stare into the abyss, which is the shadow that's cast by their turning their backs on God. And so there's the consequent will, which is what God allows or permits for the sake of a greater good. And this is because God sees the universe with something of a bird's eye view, where all the things end up, and he sees all these things as resulting in a greater good if he allows certain evils in a material creation or a creation where there are free creatures who use their will in an appropriate manner. Now, we can't see what any particular evil may lead to for ourselves. Why is it that we're all in quarantine for this ridiculous virus for what? I've been in quarantine for 21 days. I haven't gone out. I mean, beyond going on for, my runs with my son, I haven't done any. I haven't gone to the store or anything else for 21 days. My wife has only left the house twice in that time. Why? Why is this happening? We can't see it, but God can. Be nice if he clued us into it sometimes, but we can trust him that because he is good and everything, and that actions follow upon being, and God's being is goodness itself. That whatever God does is going to be good for us as his creation. But directly speaking, God causes good things to exist, but evil exists as a necessary consequence for some greater good that we cannot understand, given our perception of the world. We're like the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings. We'd be fine just sitting in the Shire, smoking our pipes and eating our potatoes, playing our games. But every once in a while, God calls us to an adventure that causes us to experience all sorts of untold sufferings and evils or inconveniences. Sometimes it's just simply an inconvenience that we call suffering. But God, he's like Tolkien. He's got the whole good of the world. He's got the whole Middle Earth all wrapped up into his mind. He knows exactly what he's aiming for and why it's going to be better for his creation in the long run than if he simply allowed us to stay within our hole in the ground as hobbits. We'll talk more about the problem of evil next week. There are some very interesting, uniquely Thomistic arguments about why it is the case that God can be perfectly good and allow evil. Thank you guys. God bless. Stay safe. And looking forward to your guys' papers.